speech. First of all, the economic impact of this on China and the capacity for the CCP to use that for the legitimacy of their governance. And secondly, the implications of this on the Taiwanese mainland China relations, which is another aspect of the two states, the terminology that just escaped me there. First point on economic impact. It is incredibly important to bear in mind first of all, a mechanism. It is, for what we basically advocate doing in this policy is as follows. We say that the central demand for Hong Kong protesters so far has effectively been the democratic election of a chief executive into the position of power within that society. Insofar as the existing mechanism for governance that exists there is that they tend to be able to elect a legislature, we would accrue and give in to the existing current demand of protesters to allow them to have their chief executive and in general have the CCP take a less interventionist approach in this governance and trying to transition towards a model that effectively is what accrues to a lesser extent to what happens in Taiwan. So where they acknowledge that it is a separate independent, they don't acknowledge that it's independent, but rather that they allow its government structures to implement completely not without interference, but instead accept that they are one nation, one singular China in that effect. So that's effectively what the mechanism is to how we would do this. The first thing we would advocate first of all on economic impact. We think Hong Kong is incredibly important to the Chinese economy. We think ultimately that this process will be very bad for the Chinese economy. And going on from that, we think that this being bad for the Chinese economy will be bad for the economic conditions within China, which in turn is bad for the legitimacy of the CCP, which uses the economic conditions of China as the basis for it to maintain its governance. It effectively what it is that it can benefit economically the people within China, and in lieu of that, it does not guarantee them the same kind of political rights that you might get in other parts of the world. So why is that Hong Kong is beneficial for the Chinese mainland, and why exactly is it that the current instability there is in turn bad for that? Well, Hong Kong is a massive international established port city that dates back to the British Empire and the connections and infrastructure it accrues. An enormous amount of capital comes into Hong Kong that then eventually fluctuates its way through the rest of China. It is able to attract enormous sums of investment that ultimately benefits China in a number of ways. First of all, it's the firms and businesses it brings to China who, once they are there, can make connections. They gain staff who learn the language. They gain influence with the understanding of the culture, and then they use the bases and infrastructure they already have there, the supply lines they built up and the proximity they have to then move businesses that are already in Hong Kong towards the mainland and towards other parts of the south. They benefit also from currency that has moved in, because the yuan is a controlled currency within China. However, the currency that is used within Hong Kong is uncontrolled, meaning the capital flow and movements there is beneficial. So to have more of that currency moving within mainland China is beneficial for more businesses being able to operate there and gaining that precedent. But also it's very important regarding intellectual property, and this links into why this will deter future investment, because intellectual property rights are far stronger in Hong Kong than they are in the mainland. And this is important going forward, because the massive stumbling block so far in terms of Chinese liberalization since the 90s has been the lack of liberalization of intellectual property laws, both regarding patents, but also the fear for investors within those regions that ultimately that the rights of the rule of law regarding the property that they buy to invest there are not secure. Hong Kong is an example of where those rights are incredibly strong. It is very problematic to set the precedent in the eyes of international investors that the Chinese government is willing to crack down specifically or overemphasize influence in the regions that have that most beneficial intellectual property laws. Well, instead, what China should be doing is signaling that it is moving towards, at least economically, if not politically, the Hong Kong model regarding international property law to gain more international investment and to gain more benefit. Other additional reasons as to why businesses will not be likely to invest in Hong Kong. The instability that comes from the reality of protests is something that risk-averse businesses do not want to operate in, specifically in the historical context of China and what has occurred there. It is problematic at the point in which you have protests on the street on a regular basis, because before the recent protests, you had the umbrella protests. It was the Hong Kong Parliament was stalled. You have huge parts of the city centre where people simply cannot do business for large weeks of the year. You get people unwilling to build or buy new property because they're afraid it will be damaged, and you simply have an inability for investors to be willing to put money down on the ground because they're unsure exactly what the political system in Hong Kong is going to be going forward. Will it become a more liberalised political system, or will China crack down on it more further? We think a clear statement from the Chinese government that it's backing off will give that degree of confidence. Because of the economic advantages I already listed in the first part of this point, it is incredibly important for the financial incentives of the CCP. Because going forward, this interference isn't benefiting a great deal for the CCP. Ultimately, they are still held by the terms of the existing contract that they signed with the British government that they will not occupy Hong Kong at any time in the immediate future. So they're not benefiting anything from this, from just creating instability in the economic part of the world. So what are they losing on the comparative? They are losing a region of the world that is extremely economically beneficial and benefits the south of China to a very significant extent. The CCP considers, above all else, the economic prosperity of its citizens to be paramount, because since the demands for democracy in the early 90s and the economic liberalization has been a fundamental way of keeping millions of Chinese satisfied with the status quo that exists there, because they are happy ultimately with the economic conditions and growth, meaning they are more concerned with the fact that their socio-economic rights are provided for than necessarily additional rights otherwise that would be provided for. So they would not ascertain and demand democratic rights as much as they otherwise might do. Before I move on to my second point, I will take a POI. Yes, go.
So this is all contingent on China's current efforts never being able to be successful. Otherwise, all of your benefits apply to us because China wants to claim Hong Kong's economic success.
No, because even at the point in which they can claim Hong Kong's... No, our point is not contingent on claiming Hong Kong's economic success. Because we have a significant amount of analysis that claims Hong Kong, as it is doing, is bringing capital flows and encouraging investors to base themselves also in China. And so moving on to the second point, which is implications for in terms of Taiwan. It is important to bear in mind that Taiwan, as distinct from Hong Kong, is part of the One China, Two Systems process. But the way they do it is significantly different. Taiwan is de facto independent and has no meaningful influence from China because they are controlled by a separate military capacity. That means China cannot easily occupy or interfere with them. What Taiwan does recognize is that it is part of One China and that mainland China and Taiwan are the same country, but they are governed distinctly and separately. What China has been doing for years is to try and persuade Taiwan to become more economically integrated. The Kuomintang, the political party that supports that, has come under pressure since the end of the dictatorship in Taiwan by the Green movement in Taiwan, which has encouraged a Taiwanization of Taiwan to give a distinct sense of independence and influence. What it uses to prevent demands or support for integration with China is point to instances in Hong Kong and say, we will lose our democracy, we will lose our economic systems, we will lose everything if we go with them, because look what happens to places within the One China, Two Systems policy who integrate further. That makes it unpopular, that makes the Green movement more popular, and it makes the Chinese dream of a singular China infinitely more difficult. Even if that's not true in the short run, the reality is if you make it impossible and create a long-term political dominance by the Green movement going forward, you make it so much more difficult for Taiwan to integrate, which is much more important for China because they're already reasonably close to Hong Kong and they're not at all close to Taiwan. Very happy to propose.
Our case is that going forward, based on the current protest environment as well as the trends towards democratization of Hong Kong, the only way that China can continue to co-opt the benefits of Hong Kong's economic success is if they envelope them within a one country, one system program, right? So I'm going to bring you exactly the incentives of the Communist Party and what they want and why it's within their interest to implement the one system within Hong Kong, why Hong Kong would continue to fight back under their side of the house, even if they did continue to infringe on this, and why that's bad, and why it would stop on our side, and then why effectively this policy benefits China to a greater extent than what they bring us on the gov bench. Okay, getting into exactly what the Communist Party wants. So we think that the CCP's party within China and what their how they're able to maintain control and engage in this kind of unique model of globalization when they've been able to co-opt all the benefits of economic success and globalization without offering their citizens any democracy is that it's based on their economic supremacy within the region, right? So they have to continue to be able to get tax revenue from Hong Kong, attract global businesses and stuff like this in order for the mainland China to be perceived as economically successful. We think that just because the Chinese Communist Party fears opposition more than anything else, right? So we think that we see this within mainland China with opposition with things like the Uyghurs. We think they see this even with Hong Kong while they're paying gangs most likely and stuff to fight against protesters. We think that because of the status quo towards extradition and towards this thing where China is trying to take more control, the Hong Kong people kind of seeing this. So we just think that because they want this complete control, it's ultimately more politically useful for them to have this. Okay, so now I'm going to explain to you why Hong Kong essentially would continue to fight this, why they would be unsuccessful, which then just causes more instability. So we think that just because of the extent of the protests thus far, and because of what they've told you about democratization, even if this kind of one party two system or one country two or continues, we think that protesters will continue to protest even under this system. We think that these people will stop at nothing until they have full independence, because every new piece of legislation that is put through the Hong Kong parliament and stuff like that is going to continue to be fight. The bill for extradition that began this protest movement in the first place has already been struck down by parliament. They have decided not to extradite. But because the people have said that this is always a possibility, that we will do this to China, they're going to continue to keep fighting until they get full independence, right? So we think while they maintain this one country, two system model of things, there's always going to be fundamental protests, right? So we think the only way that China can kind of do this is by kind of abandoning this completely. No, thank you. What else was I getting onto? Okay. However, we think that they will largely be unsuccessful. We think that within the region, there is no power, like the Hong Kong protesters themselves, they have no army of their own, no police force on their side. They're not just going to be able to keep up with this for as long as they want to. So if China did decide to implement the system that is the same level of control, no thank you, as mainland China, we think that they would be able to just because of their huge military. There is a provision within the dual constitution that does allow China to invade in the event that the Hong Kong people are rising up or something like that. We also think that just the other people in the region, the other powers just don't have as much military power as possible. Second to the US, China has the largest military in the entire world, meaning if they wanted to stamp this out, they very much could. We also think that China continues to receive backing from the Western world just as long as they maintain the guise that Hong Kong is a liberal province, even if they don't have these laws that we want. We think we still see people going to Beijing on holiday. We still see people engaging with cities like Shanghai, despite the fact that they don't have this economic or not economic, politically liberal climate that we do see in Hong Kong, just because they're seen as cosmopolitan cities. We think as long as there are consumers to buy things and there's things to see, we think they maintain this relationship with the Western world, because China is seen as such a global power that people don't necessarily want to conflict them directly, but they also know that they can benefit or co-opt a lot of the success in this. Okay, so essentially, we agree with government to the extent that this instability stays when people continue to fight the one-party, two-system thing, but that necessarily happens on their side of the house. China also, I think we can increase the level of benefits that they are getting from Hong Kong, which is what this motion is, and in the interest of the Communist Party, when we put them under the same model of mainland China. And I'm going to give you 4 reasons as to why that is fundamentally true. One, we think that they can extract more economic benefits from that places. From Hong Kong. So I've already given you reasons why Beijing and Shanghai can compete with Hong Kong and other reasons. We think because they are just global cities that have lots of consumers, businesses are inclined to go there. We think we see Western law firms, Western production companies that are basing themselves in these cities, despite the fact that they don't have the same democratic system. Global business is not reliant on a politically liberal climate. We think that this fundamental protest culture, as they say, is a lot more harmful than just having to exist under China's relatively straightforward legislation that means you just kind of have to do whatever the Communist Party wants. We also think that if they put them under the same system and put them within the Chinese sphere, you just have a lot more ability to extract tax revenue from Hong Kong. Because some of the wealthiest people in the world live within wealthiest people within China live in Hong Kong, as well as the fact that they could implement new tax structures with the lack of independence. We also just think you could do a lot on mainland China with that revenue. No, thank you. Okay. Secondly, on global image. So I think I've already given you reasons why China's global image doesn't fundamentally change when they put Hong Kong under this system, right? We think because you have other cosmopolitan cities in China, as well as the fact that the West doesn't want to engage with them negatively because they rely on them for things like their export economy, as well as just because they are just a militarily very strong force. We think that this doesn't fundamentally change their global image. I'll take a point from back half if they have one. Okay, no worries. Okay, so no thank you. Finally, moving on to how this affects the other provinces. So we think despite what opening government tell you, if they continue to maintain this one country, two systems program within Hong Kong, it gives a lot of bargaining power to provinces like Macau, like Taiwan, to continue to argue for this, right? We think if they continue to see a protest movement in Hong Kong and China doesn't stamp this out, it gives people not only within these secondary provinces, but also people who are dissenting within mainland China, a voice with which to protest. And this is really bad for the Communist Party. Like I said in my framing, what the Communist Party wants effectively and what their singular goal is to maintain supreme control over China. The only way they do this is if they signal that Hong Kong is not separate and not unique. We think that it allows people like what I've already said to you, Macau, Taiwan, even the Uyghur provinces to continue these protest movements if they do that. Finally, I think that Hong Kong is very important strategically and militarily for China and their expeditions within the South China Sea as we move forward. Hong Kong, as it is, cannot be used as a military base for China because of this one country, two systems program that we have there. They're the farthest geographically out from China, which means they're really important within their expedition or expansionary procedures within the South China Sea, meaning that if they could put economic or military bases on this island, it would be very important for them in fighting the US as well as Japan, which is the other like major military area in this, or place in this area. China can continue to co-opt all of Hong Kong's benefits if they put them under this system, as well as more by stamping out this kind of protest movement and trend within the region. So proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker, and I welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
Three parts of this speech. Firstly, extending on the issue of Taiwan. Secondly, why stability will return, and a little bit about projecting into the future if protests are allowed to continue. And thirdly, why this doesn't undermine the ability of the CCP to be politically authoritarian in the rest of China. Firstly, on Taiwan. No response to our point about Taiwan in the last speech. It is economically important for China to maintain goals with Taiwan. We give you specific actor analysis to do with the Kuomintang and the Green Party in that. God, it's very. Oh, yeah, that's what you're giving me that for. Very important for those yes, thank you. No, I've got it here. For those actors to do that. But secondly, this is an incredibly important ideological goal of the CCP and stands apart from other areas in this debate. Why do we know that, right? We know that in the past, Taiwan has sacrificed other political gains, other economic gains, in terms of even the smallest undermining of its ability to project in the future a relationship with Taiwan that they want. Because within the CCP, we don't even need to prove that this will mean that Taiwan actually joins China, but even if it reduces the chance of it joining China. Because China wouldn't join the UN because of the recognition of the UN by Taiwan. It was only after the UN stopped recognizing Taiwan that that China actually entered into the UN. So I think that is, loads of international organizations operate like this. So this is incredibly important to them, and we think that it should be weighed in this debate. But secondly, why will stability return? Yes. They say, well, protests will just continue. Firstly, we think protesters have very clear demands, and we are giving them what they want. They want elections to the chief executive to be democratic, and we will give them that. Secondly, I would contend that the protesters are not extremely in favor of Western-style democracy in the manner that they suggest. Why? Because the negative attitudes toward the sense of Hong Kong having been a colony by the British Empire pervade, and this comes and protests happen in spite of that, not because of that. What that means is a sense of cooperating with China and coexisting with China are important goals for Hong Kong, because they don't want to be saying things like, for instance, we were better off as a colony, and if they want to continue to cooperate, they will do so. So we think if we give them their demands, they are very likely to give in. How will democratic election behave in Hong Kong? We think we will still have the executive in terms of the demands that are made. It's not even to exclusively have a democratic election to the executive, because it's about 1,800 people on that. It's just to have a proportion of that democratic elected. So you continue to have the interests of, for instance, the CCP operating to some extent, and also the interests of executives and business people who populate a lot of that. So they can continue to act in the manner that we suggested of economic liberalization. No, thank you. But secondly, the people of Hong Kong support the kind of policies that we're talking about. They support low regulation because it facilitates their businesses as they currently exist. They support not having currency controls because that allows them to facilitate trade. And this is the third and important thing. What will happen in terms of what Chris proves is that financial services firms will leave if Hong Kong continues to be unstable. Because, first of all, violence in the streets is not a particularly attractive way to have businesses. And with the way these financial services firms work is to attract very effective people who could move anywhere in the world, and you need to be able to pitch Hong Kong as somewhere that is good for these places. Secondly, they care a lot about public relations, because they themselves have an ethical concern for what is going on in Hong Kong, but often that can, you see that it's in the way that so many businesses have ethical and charity arms for this very reason, and so if they're accused of operating in Hong Kong, that is likely to be terrible. What happens when those financial services firms leaves? It means the demand for the currency in Hong Kong is kept is kept at a high value because you've got about a 50% financial services economy and about a 50% facilitation of trade economy, right? So what happens when the financial services firms leave is the demand for that currency massively reduces because you're not having operations through that anymore. That's, for instance, why London, the pound is so highly valued, is because financial services in London relative to the rest of the economy. What happens when you see that drop in the value of the currency is the trade that Hong Kong facilitates, which is largely facilitating exports from China, particularly the south of China, through Hong Kong to the rest of the world. You massively reduce the value of those exports. We're talking 50, 60% here, huge margins if the currency value is halved. So that means that the whole of China is affected because they have a controlled currency which isn't able to facilitate trade as effectively. So yes, I'll take you now.
So financial services firms leave to a greater extent that there's political instability every day, which we've given you reasons for. In the extent that they do leave, they just move to other cities where they can operate under CCP guidelines relatively.
So they actually don't, right? So insofar as they have an interest in doing financial services, they can do that pretty much anywhere in the world, right? So they can do it, and these are footloose industries, right? Because you just need to move people around, and like for a company that is making millions and millions in investments and that sort of thing, buying a new office isn't a big deal. And you have countries nearby, you've got places like Singapore, you've got the relatively deregulated economies of Southeast Asia where they can and will relocate to. So this is why the consumer's point that they talk about isn't relevant, because businesses do not locate in Hong Kong because of the large consumer base primarily. That's not the biggest part of the Hong Kong economy, so I don't think that this is, that is necessarily in the debate. What will happen if protests continue? First of all, I think we're likely to see escalation, not de-escalation, because once you start shooting people on the streets, as has happened in Hong Kong, people act in a more violent way because they now is not just an issue in terms of extradition, or in terms of democracy, it is now an issue in terms of this government killed my brother, or that sort of thing. What are we likely to see? I think we're likely to see, because protests in Hong Kong identify the incentives we're talking about targeted attacks of businesses. We're talking targeted attacks on the ability of financial services firms to operate in places like Hong Kong because they don't want China getting those dividends from the operation of that. And we see, and if you don't believe that, as a result of conflicts, previously effective economies can collapse. I mean, look to Beirut in the Lebanon. Look at so many places which once were financial centers but collapsed once there was a level of instability. But thirdly, their alternative, which they suggest, is invasion, right? If invasion happens, not only will that precipitate more currency fall because of expectations, right? But that is a massive fear in terms of imposition of the Chinese army on the operations of businesses within Hong Kong. So Chris talked about intellectual property rights and that sort of thing. If you have literally the Red Army on your doorstep, I think that perception grows a great deal worse. And if that's the alternative that they support going forward in terms of reaction to the escalation of protests, I think it's not a good one. So why doesn't this undermine political authoritarianism in China? First of all, democratization on a local level is already occurring in China to a certain extent, and the chief executive is a local body. But secondly, Hong Kong's relationship is already exceptional insofar as Macau does not have the basic laws that Hong Kong does. And thirdly, the political control in the rest of China is effective enough for them in terms of Zhangjiang and these sorts of places that it doesn't really matter if there's more fear, because if you don't have that, because they're able to control them effectively through indoctrination, all that sort of thing. So we're delighted to stand in proposition. Thank you very much.
Alright, I thank that speaker. I now welcome Deputy
I actually use your water bottle. Chair, adjudicator, ladies and gentlemen, firstly I'm going to respond to the last speaker by addressing what they talked to you about how the CCP functions. Secondly, there's stuff that comes in the last speech on Taiwan. Then secondly, clash the main points in this debate so far by talking about how Hong Kong benefits China, and the ways that they talk about aren't actually entirely relevant to this debate. So firstly, two things under what the CCP wants. I think firstly important to note is that when they talk about personal freedoms, Hong Kong having attracting people in that way, that is not incredibly relevant to the way the Chinese economy currently operates, right? Because it's an output economy. It relies on manufacturing. So things like having new ideas and innovation aren't relevant to the Chinese economy, and that it doesn't rely on them at all. Because in as much as there will always be consumer demand globally and China's outputs globally, innovation is not something that China relies on. So actually, that kind of cracking down on democratic freedoms massively benefits the CCP, in that it is the only way that they're able to continue to have power. Because obviously, if there was like democratic will, like in any part of China, you wouldn't operate as a CCP because it's a one-party system. But furthermore, like the fact that like they tell you that the kind of democracy in Hong Kong and people being able to talk about things not really relevant to the CCP, in as much as their power relies on the economic growth of China and maintaining that, and because the economic growth of China doesn't rely on freedoms, that doesn't matter. The second thing is that they need to signal to businesses that they are business friendly. Firstly, I think the CCP only status quo only really acknowledges businesses that are willing to engage within their current strict regulations, and they're actually pretty effective at forcing businesses to engage with that. Notice how they provide a lot of the welfare within China, for example. But secondly, China is just such a huge market. Like, the kind of professional services that they want to talk to you about literally rely on large corporations and firms that have huge amounts of capital, for example, economies of scale that all need regulations. And that's why when companies turn to the things like professional services firms that they talk to you about in their speech. Because China is such a huge market, those professional services firms are still going to want to engage with it. So we think it's extremely likely that they're going to be willing to bow down to all of the CCP's demands. So for those reasons, I think the CCP, it's pretty credible that they're going to get what they want. Then moving on to what they bring you about Taiwan. Firstly, on a larger, broad point on this, I'm really unclear why Taiwan actually matters a huge amount in this debate, or to China at all. Secondly, I think they prove that to you when they tell you, oh well, the UN wasn't willing to, China and the UN disagreed. Notice that China is now currently in the UN. Clearly, it wasn't important enough in that circumstance on a global scale for the UN to continue to prioritize it. So I don't know why it actually matters. But even if it does, we tell you that China is in a much better position with regards to Taiwan when it owns and has huge amounts of control in Hong Kong, because even from a geographical perspective, they are much closer to it. Finally, with regards to cooperation on a regional level, again, China doesn't rely on cooperation, it relies on force. And this is not a normative point in telling you that that is a good thing or a positive thing on a global level, but it's working pretty well for the CCP in that they've lifted millions of people out of poverty and continue to be a popular party that people are willing to bow down to in return to what it gives them. So because of this, cooperation and giving people freedoms and that kind of thing works a lot less well for the CCP than the use of force and cracking down on democratic freedoms. No, thank you. Moving on, the kind of second broad part of this speech, which is about how the Hong Kong benefits China. What do they tell us on this? The first thing they say is about the currency, and they make a really big deal out of this in their speech, but it's actually not important because China fixes its currency. It's not reliant on things like stability or on the markets. That is literally just the nature of it. So if the fluxes and the comparison to the pound that they want to talk to you about don't happen in China and aren't in this debate, no thank you. Then they say, secondly, instability is important. Lucy proves to you, and they don't respond to you. Respond to her. She tells you in her speech that instability remains to be the case. No, thank you. Unless China are willing to give Hong Kong full freedoms, which in no circumstance, including the government case, is not going to happen. So that kind of instability continues to happen. But no, thank you. But what kind of protests do we hear from them? The status quo protests aren't actually that popular. We get a huge mischaracterization from opening government on this, because while it is true that they have been violent and they have had a lot of media coverage, there is also a huge number of people in Hong Kong who view them incredibly negatively. So things like storming the parliament, killing people on subways and attacking people has not gone down well with large swathes of Hong Kong, because traditionally it's seen as an extremely safe place for people to live, and furthermore, things like the expats leaving Hong Kong are as a result of these protests mean that they're not likely to continue to be as violent as they are status quo. But then they tell you, okay, so then in terms of benefits, they say, oh, well, we're on opposition side, we're never going to actually be able to get huge benefits from China because or from the CCP continuing this, is because they still have to be compatible with the deal with the UK. The UK doesn't care that much about Hong Kong, and actually I think this is proven by the fact that they put really weak controls in the deal in the first place to be able to deal with this kind of thing. But secondly, China is a much stronger power, status quo, than the UK, and that is a fact. It has a larger military, and it also has a lot of really strong allies, status quo. So then they tell you finally that it attracts business. I already respond to this by saying businesses there don't, obviously if they still want to access China, that is a much greater advantage, and that is the largest market in the world. But furthermore, the biggest impact in this debate is that the kind of businesses that Hong Kong relies on aren't the kind that are in the manufacturing industry. So it's the threat to the threat to the CCP's stability that Hong Kong poses that China needs to crack down on. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
I thank opening half an hour to start off with by member of government.
Panel, I think top half kind of misses the debate when they are talking about the importance of Hong Kong, especially when they're talking about the economic importance of Hong Kong. Because even though Hong Kong is a very successful city-state within China, it is absolutely nothing compared to Chinese GDP, right? It is completely insignificant. It is 4 million people that are doing really well, but nothing compared to 1.5 billion people working day and night within the CCP. But second of all, note that top half never explains how the economic benefits of Hong Kong actually trickle down to China, right? Because currently it's mostly Western companies in Hong Kong themselves benefiting from them. At some point, maybe Hong Kong would become part of China again, but probably at that point, it will disappear into Chinese communist state again, which means that all the benefits of Hong Kong now practically being a Western state would disappear. So therefore, I'm not sure why this kind of stuff and this clash is relevant to the debate. Opening opposition talks firstly about that people will always keep protesting. I think that's a very easy characterization of this debate that basically makes it sort of zero difference between prop and op. I have a more realistic characterization for you. The people in Hong Kong will not always keep protesting and are rational. Note that over the last years, at all times, they had the Chinese threat hanging over their head. But at the point where they feel like they have their own state, enough autonomy to make a living, are doing well. These people also just want to make a normal life for themselves and are doing well. Only at the point where China is infringing and introducing bills like this, that is when you see these protests coming up. Note that what we are supporting is a China that's willing to negotiate. A China that does everything to contain tensions within Hong Kong, is willing to talk to these people, refrain from imposing bills, even in the most extreme case, negotiate about the terms of the Hong Kong reintroduction into China. Then they say we can easily take Hong Kong. I think that's just clearly and also intuitively nonsense, right? China cannot just take control of Hong Kong. They aren't willing to risk conflict or war with Western vested interests within the city. The entire world watching for the 4 million people that are there, I think that's highly unrealistic. They're probably posing more risks. Now, moving into extension material. Note, the first question, which I think top half barely talked about, is what are actually the interests of the CCP, right? What we say is that the 100% top priority of the CCP is internal stability and control within their party and within China. This is for two reasons. The first one is that all other benefits to the party and all other incentives that they possibly have are dependent on remaining in effective control, not cracking this down. The second reason is that internal instability is simply the biggest existential threat that exists towards the CCP. They need to control 1.5 billion people. That requires a huge bureaucracy of people working together. They need control over massively varying areas, different populations, etc. The way huge empires fall is not due to external threats, but it's due to internal crumbling, people competing for power within the party, conflicts of interest, etc., that make sure that at the end of the day crumble their empire. That is the biggest risk that they are facing. If we show that infringing on Hong Kong poses reasonable risks to the CCP's internal power and stability in China, this risk is most important to the CCP's interests. An important caveat: we don't need to prove that internal control will disappear or will fall. We just need to show that there exists a reasonable threat that this is something that can happen when they keep infringing on Hong Kong. Because if only there's a 1% chance, the costs of this happening are so huge, basically losing everything, that a party like this would never want to take a risk so big that can sort of cost them everything. Especially because the benefits that the rest of the debate talked about are basically just non-existent compared to this. Now, note, why is infringement a threat to internal control of the CCP? Note that Hong Kong is protesting the current attempts hard. That is for 4 reasons. The first one is because it is a city with Western norms and values that are fundamentally oppositional to the ideology of the CCP. It is semi-autonomous, and before it was Western colony, it is completely different in the way of looking at sort of fundamental values and rights. The second reason is that it's an incredibly wealthy area, which allows the type of organization within the protests that you are seeing in Hong Kong that would be very difficult to do in other kinds of places. The third reason is that they have free media in Hong Kong, which means that the people are aware what's going on, they are aware what China is doing, but second of all, the rest of the world is watching, which means China cannot crack down too hard within Hong Kong. The fourth reason Hong Kong is protesting so hard against these attempts is Western support, right? There are vested interests of businesses that are operating there, expats, people that are living there, that also don't want China to infringe on the rights of Hong Kong. That, added with the collective fear that the West has of China, means that they want to contain them. They do support these kind of protests that are existent. That has 2 important conclusions. The first one is that every infringement on the rights of Hong Kong exponentially increases protests because of all these incentives. But the second one is that Hong Kong is the unique place in China where this kind of opposition can occur. There are no other places that are like this, that have these 4 things that I just talked about. Why are these protests then harmful to the CCP's internal power? Note that these protests do leak to other Chinese areas as well. They cannot fully control media. Things are getting online. People are getting aware of them, even though it's very difficult. The second reason is that there are individuals, bureaucrats, soldiers, etc., that are involved within the conflict, that are aware of this going on. The third reason is foreign Chinese people seeing it on the media, being aware of the huge protests that are going on. And the fourth reason is the many moguls that are in Hong Kong, which are heavily interconnected in China, right? They call Hong Kong the city where millionaires of China go to gamble and trade with the West, right? Those are still very important, powerful, elite people in China that are aware of the opposition that is occurring to the CCP. Now, why is this then problematic? The first reason is because Hong Kong is doing well against the CCP, which shows it isn't unbreakable. It exposes cracks, and it shows the collectiveness. It shows that at the moment you're living in China and you're angry at the CCP, you are not alone. There are other people as well. People are collective. How does that then pose a risk? First of all, other contentious areas within China, Taiwan, Tibet, and Shenzhen, Shenzhen, for example. These are areas where small things like big fires, where people are already angry, and being aware that these kind of protests are going on leads to domino effects. This is how protests work, right? There's a reason why the Arabic Spring all happens in occurrence to each other. You see these things going on, you see there's a moment of opportunity, people are likely to rise up. But second of all, internal political competitors. Chinese millionaires with huge interest, vested interest in Hong Kong, are supporting internal opponents within the CCP. There are political rivalries that are going on there. I think the risk to the power that they have is so large compared to the non-importance of Hong Kong. Don't take the risk.
All right, I thank that speaker. I now welcome member of opposition.
think this is okay.
Yeah. The way we extend our opening government is that we firstly show why these protests are extremely effective. Given that there's a huge harm to all of opposition side, given that their case relies on them actually having control over Hong Kong. Secondly, within that protest, there's a huge threat of you losing internal power within China. That is the most important thing, and it was barely touched by the closing opposition, which is why they lose. I'm going into rebuttal on closing opposition first, then I'm going to explain why extension is most important. I'm going to talk about opening opposition and very shortly about opening government. So, CEO claims that protests cannot be kept up. And that is firstly because the morale will start fading away at the moment that they keep losing, and secondly because it's extremely costly. So note, and because they were shot by their own police. So note that they've already had huge wins, right? They had this bill retracted. That is a huge win, and I think that morale will then becomes better. Look, the fact that your own police is shooting on you is not necessarily an analytical reason, because they don't feel like that police is actually part of Hong Kong. So that actually doesn't work in their favor. It actually feels like the enemy. So I don't necessarily think that it will happen. But as China will do this step by step, as they claim, right? Because they are not going to invade, which is just unlikely. Given that they're doing it step by step, we see that Hong Kong has an extremely amount to lose. Because as David tells you, the entire system of Hong Kong is based on not being included in a state market, in a state economy, right? A state-based economy. Because all its businesses, all the people that work there, all the people who have money, who are protesting, the students who are protesting, all of them benefit of Hong Kong by it being a competitive market. Because at the moment that you're included in China, that will mean that all your businesses will die off. Either because they're disallowed by the CCP, or because they're simply outcompeted by the state businesses. That will happen. Given that this is so costly, every time China tries to do something, the protest will happen. Then they say the Chinese CCP is able to control the narrative on Hong Kong. I don't necessarily think that's true, given that 1/3 of the fucking country is on the streets, right? So clearly they're not very good at controlling that narrative, or the narrative can be altered by literally 1/3 of the people that you know when you live in Hong Kong, given that it's a 5 million nation and 1.5 million people are literally on the street protesting every single day for months. I don't necessarily think that they can control the narrative. And then they say they can take out Hong Kong's money. I'm unsure, A, whether this is extremely effective, given that the West will extremely crack down on this. They say the EU and the US do not want to do something because they're afraid of China. But the reason they're currently not doing anything is because they're not economically harmed themselves when they do something. But now they see their own businesses failing, their own investments crumbling at the moment that China does something. And that is why China hasn't done so, because it could have done so. China could have already taken control over Hong Kong. They could have already invaded. But they're not doing that because they're not willing to threat like an all-out war or an economic war with the West. It's just unlikely what they're saying, right? So and even if they can take out some of Hong Kong's money and some of Hong Kong's trade, that is still better than the alternative of being included in that state. So that didn't make sense. But as a general remark, these protests are extremely good. They're extremely well organized. It's 1.5 million people. Imagining 1.5 million people all thinking together how they can best fuck the state over. These are extremely smart people. They're extremely rich because they're funded by Western companies and companies within Hong Kong because they have a lot to gain, and a lot of people support that. Imagine like that protest being extremely good. So for example, when the government uses lasers, these protesters are able to direct their lasers so their faces cannot be recognized. All those kind of things is technology that the protesters have, and they're just extremely good. So it's just unlikely that it will totally get Hong Kong. And maybe they will take a few steps, but it will be huge protest, which is extremely harmful. Then their only mechanism is you cannot give in to political dissent. There's a reason why we spend the entire extension on why the CCP is unlikely, is on a bigger threat to lose their power when they do this. That is because it is very hard to explain how the CCP has its power and how how there can be a risk of them losing power, right? That's an extremely high burden. But we have met it with the entire extension, not just one sentence, right? So what did we explain then? We say that Hong Kong is the only place where this can happen, and that it flows over into China. And that's because there's millionaires in Hong Kong and in China funding the CCP. Basically, that's where the CCP is based on. You have expats, you have Western Chinese people will see this on the media. And all of this creates cracks in a system. China spends, even though they're economically pretty good, spends a lot of money on propaganda. That's because they want you to believe that there's no possibility of attacking the CCP. This will bring cracks into that system. And also note, it's unclear whether China in 5 or 10 years can rely on its economic benefits. So they need this, right? So when you start having cracks in that system and other factors which are quite likely will happen, it is more likely that you will get a risk. Quickly on OO then. OO says, so that is why there's a risk. And if we show a risk, we're already more important than the first half. OO then says CCP will get more benefits from Hong Kong if it includes it in the system. But by including it, you lose the benefit of Hong Kong because their entire market is based on the competitive market. So they might be able to get all the taxes, but there are very limited companies to extract that tax from. So it really doesn't matter that much that you have Hong Kong when you crumble that economy. But also they never explained how they're going to take like Hong Kong, right? Given that we have all these mechanisms, we surely beat them. Then OG. So I don't know where this paper is. No, a little bit more on OO. No, more on OG. OG says Hong Kong is rich, they have a different currency, they have intellectual property. And that is why they have a benefit to the Chinese economy. Firstly, they didn't explain why this benefit is something that is important for the CCP to have power. But secondly, and more importantly, they never, that is based on Hong Kong being taken over. Because if they aren't taken over, that intellectual property still exists. So they have a problem there, then that basically also isn't very impactful. That's why we win this debate. Thanks, guys.
I want to clarify a few things at the start of this speech. I think most people in this debate massively, I guess, don't exaggerate the scale of what's exactly happening, because literally what government are setting up is China actively conceding to demands which have been given through a protest. This has impacts which are far beyond, like, Hong Kong and Taiwan, but all of the domestic control that China has, being able to show that protests are never successful and can never listen. I think particularly given like people, there's more and more access to information. People are able to see that this is happening much more. All the things which opening government want to tell you about how this is going to be economically devastating, are reasons that China wants to show that protests are economically devastating and therefore you should not have them so that you can be able to have the more successful Chinese model. Giving into protests is something which is going to have more repercussions than I think anyone emphasized. But secondly, to clarify that I think both government teams just assert that this action will therefore stop the protest. Closing government characterized this by saying, well, people can be kept happy with some concessions, they'll be appeased because they have a life, they'll have like a better standard of life like the rest of China. But the thing is, the people in the midst of these extreme protests, the ones who are being violent, the ones who are getting international media attention, aren't the ones who are appeased by this concession. They're the ones who are proposing for independence and more democracy in Hong Kong. I think particularly when you open the gates to say that the Chinese government is willing to listen to protests, is willing to make some concessions, that's the point at which you have a massive gateway to all the other political impacts they want to talk about. I don't think they ever do that. But I think the third thing then is that if that happens, I don't think either government team proves why China isn't capable of shutting down protests and shutting this down and winning in that power struggle. Closing government give you reasons why protests happen in Hong Kong more than other reasons of China. They say, you know, it's wealthy, you have Western support, you have like more of a free media. These are all reasons why protests happen, but it never goes to prove why protests will be successful, given Avanab gives you structural reasons about how there's Chinese influence within those institutions. Given that, let's move on to the first clash about whether this is going to be successful and how China's going to be able to do this. Note, they say they want to be able to assert like Chinese performative legitimacy by having control there. The biggest way China can do this is by countering the free media in Hong Kong, by literally arresting dissidents, arresting people who speak up against them, which is able to have the most control at all. So if they want certainty in terms of shutting it down, that's important. CG's main reason about why Hong Kong won't concede to China, for the reasons Abhinav said, is because Hong Kong has so much to lose. Because they're economically successful, they have the economic power. This is incredibly important. Hong Kong would realistically be a special economic zone, be able to maintain its economic benefits. China's not going to be stupid about that. There are economic zones within China because it recognizes it's the way in which you protect industries and help that. That is particularly important, given all of the economic things they want to say are so special about Hong Kong are reasons that China wants to claim them as Hong Kong, rather than showing that if you're detached from China and you have a separate system and you have protests which are proposing against that, you're able to be more successful. Because even when opening governments say things like, oh, they want to like copy the Hong Kong model because it's so successful, that China doesn't want to do that unless it's actively co-opting those benefits of Hong Kong, which only happens if you push forward to having them in the system rather than conceding to their demands and having them perceived as being a separate body and a separate government. That's incredibly important. So I don't think this will happen in the way they want to talk about. Given Hong Kong is going to be able to keep its economic capital, what are the reasons so much more important about why China is going to be able to coerce their hand? I think, internal stability and control. Firstly, I think even in government's best case, giving or entrenching or legitimizing some autonomy that Hong Kong have rather than trying to stop it means that over time this rabbles into more control and more calls for outcry, to be more outspoken, because it shows that you can get something from having a concession. I think that's particularly important because when you give people like a more of a platform, like a separate system where they're not being threat of, like, for example, being arrested for being able to be speaking out, that's when they're able to be more of a rallying point. So right now, sure, you have protests, we think that's going to be temporary in the sense that like 2014 was 5 years ago, and they've been able to quash it since then, but at the point you formalize that platform within government by having a separate system where you can't be prosecuted by the Chinese government, and that means people are much more able to entrench that in the future, which undermines a lot of China's legitimacy, undermines China's ability to claim all the benefits of Hong Kong as something which is happening in their region. That's specifically important. But I think secondly, and more importantly, both government teams underestimate how much control China have right now. Closing government say, well, there's free media in Hong Kong. People are arrested and detained at the Hong Kong border when they try to leave because they have photos of the process on their phone. And Abhinav gives you structural reasons why inside the institutions, inside the legislature in Hong Kong, China are able to literally place people there. Half of the legislature is made up of functional constituencies, which are basically like professions or industries deemed as appropriate. The reason the reason people in power would choose those industries to represent them is because they're favourable towards the government. The industries are then favourable towards the government because they get extra representation. There are literal mechanisms of power which allow that to be perpetuated, such that the government won't be as independent as they want to say. Specifically given, even if they want to say the main kind of factor is economic power in Hong Kong, economic prestige in Hong Kong, they never respond to the ways in which China can destroy Hong Kong economically. They say there's a lot of this power because Hong Kong is finance industry. What China wants is to prove that Shanghai and Beijing are significantly more powerful centers. They want to operate at a loss so they can undercut Hong Kong, because right now the more Hong Kong benefit economically during the process, the more it shows that being able to have this movement away from China means that you can still benefit. China has the power to be able to stop those industries and force these businesses towards Chinese companies. No, if they say, well, companies move out of Hong Kong, that's great for China because they move into Beijing and Shanghai, which is what China actively want to attract them to do. I don't think this happens in the way they say. It does mean that Hong Kong is then held ransom. Lastly, in terms of China being able to get allies, and we tell you how other countries can't fight against China because they're taking over, there's too much to lose. And they say, oh, well, now you give Western countries an economic incentive to stand up against China because their companies are at risk in Hong Kong. The thing is, the economic interest, the economic cost of standing up against China or invading China are significantly higher than losing those businesses in Hong Kong. So even then they do it their way up of why it's not in the economic interest of countries to be able to keep China happy, not standing up against Hong Kong. Closing.
Yeah, so
if your characterization of the current power of China in Hong Kong is true, and you're going to make it a special economic zone, there's literally almost zero difference that you're making on your side of the house. The only difference is more protests, our case is true.
But there are special economic zones in China right now. Like, that's the status quo in regions of China. It's just economic policy rather than like governments there. The difference is that right now, with what China wants to do when it's successful, is have control over the systems. For example, the judiciary, so they can make control, so they can quash down dissent. Abhinav tell you how important this platform is. I think that's particularly important. But looking on then at the clash about like economics and like the currency, OG say a lot about Hong Kong's importance to the Chinese economy and the CCP and gets legitimacy. The point is then, China don't want to show them as being successful without China. That's why they need to push forward and not just grant them the autonomy which they want to have, because that's how it's going to be perceived, regardless of what the technicalities are, is that Hong Kong has a successful protest and they're outperforming China. They say things like, China wants to copy Hong Kong's laws and IP's laws are like towards that model. The last thing China wants to do is glorify a certain region being able to have a successful movement against the Chinese government and being able to impact those things there. I think the economic harm, when they want to talk about how it's like risk averse businesses don't invest, that's what China wants. It wants to show that protests aren't good, protests aren't successful, so that then those businesses get pushed towards China where there is more stability. That's literally what China wants. Either China is able to be successful, which we think it definitely will be in terms of controlling institutions to making Hong Kong part of China, functionally a part of China, or it wants to show that protests just don't work. It has the power to quash that down. I don't think we got a response to Abhinav's specific mechanisms about why this happens. Even if this wasn't the case, China is happy to absorb economic losses for political control. It always has been. China has the capacity to quash protests. This doesn't quash the worst of the protests. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank all speakers. You may cross the floor and wait outside.